Hello and welcome to another lecture. Today we're going to be talking about the Civil War. So last time we left off with Lincoln winning the election, and there's a long period of time, well, throughout all U.S. history until the mid 20th century. From when the election occurs to when the inauguration occurs. So you had about 4 months where the South was maneuvering, and you didn't really have much going on in the North as far as putting down rebellion. So Lincoln has 4 months to just watch everything fall apart on Buchanan's watch. Buchanan does try a few efforts, but they're just completely ineffectual. So there are some last-ditch efforts. There's a Crittenden bill, which is very, well, both of these are too little, too late. The Crittenden bill is an effort to extend or to continue the Missouri Compromise, and that doesn't work for many reasons, most of which we discussed last week in the well, I guess 2 weeks ago in the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1850, excuse me. There's also a constitutional amendment, which this picture portrays here, a constitutional amendment proposed in Washington, D.C., and they try to come together to stop slavery in the West, so appeasing to the North, but then also constitutionally protecting slavery in the South. So it's supposed to appease the South. And Abraham Lincoln comes out as the president-elect and supports it, but it doesn't really it doesn't pan out. So in December, you have South Carolina seceding from the Union. They're the first, and then the Fort Sumter is occupied by federal troops, and it is besieged by South Carolina militia. And there is an effort to resupply the fort, and the ships are turned away. They're sent there by Buchanan, and they're turned away by the rebel forces. And on the 12th of April, they begin the bombardment, and the next day, Fort Sumter falls. And so it's officially, well, Lincoln sees this as officially the war starting. A lot of historians see this as the official start, even though there were other things going on too. Okay, advantages for both sides. The North had a larger population. Most immigrants who were coming for the last couple decades were all coming to the North for factory jobs. Manufacturing was heavier in the North, and then at this time beginning to spread to the West, places like Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, not quite Chicago yet, but maybe it's just starting to get its footing there. The South, okay, so they were just their advantage was they were going to fight a defensive war. And so, we see that today in Ukraine. Ukraine is able to, put up a good fight against Russia because it's a defensive war. And especially back in the 1860s, they didn't have GPS. So, the North had a hard time finding good maps of the South. So that was good for the rebels. They also had more experienced officers. Now, all the officers, well, not all, but very good number of the officers at this point had been general or had been junior officers in the war with Mexico, and so that's where they really first saw combat. And then there had been this pattern of Southerners getting more leadership roles in the Union, and that part of that had to do with the way apportionment went, to doing with having to do with the 3/5 clause for apportioning and counting slaves in the South. So you had a smaller number of people well, I guess white males in the South who were disproportionately taking on more leadership roles. And they would always whine about things. This also pertains to the balance in the Senate. There's a great speech or with in the 1850s where some Southerners were boasting how they they have given the Union more generals and Supreme Court justices, and there was a Northern congressman, an abolitionist, who got up and said that, well, they do get more because they whine more, they complain more. And this Northern abolitionist said, reminded them that the people who are filling the ranks of the military are Northern men. Let's see. Let's look at some of those leaders. You have in the South, you have Jefferson Davis. He made his name in the war with Mexico. He'd been a senator for a very long time, and he becomes the president for a 6-year term in the Confederacy. And the person who becomes the highest ranking general is Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was originally asked by Abraham Lincoln to lead the Union forces. Now, since he was out, originally you had a general who had Winfield Scott, who was actually had been the general, like one of the most highest rate. Well, he'd been a general since the War of 1812, and so he was still alive, still in service, and he was not capable of getting on his horse anymore due to age and weight issues, and so he declined command because he could not get on a horse. So after that, he asked Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee declined because he saw himself more as a Virginian than as an American. So he asked General McClellan. McClellan really got on Lincoln's nerves because he didn't do enough. He just trained a lot. And then after a number of other generals, Lincoln finally, he said, I found my general with General Grant. And Ulysses Grant goes on to become president after in the late 1860s. But yeah, he's the one who really brings the war to a close. But let's talk about battles. I'm only going to mention 3 here. Got the Battle of Bull Run, and that's the first battle. These are all important battles that kind of changed the war. So the Battle of Bull Run, everybody thought it was going to be over with this one battle. The North was going to come and beat up some Southern rebels and call it a day, call it a war. But the Northerners were routed. This is in Northern Virginia, and they ran back to Washington, D.C. With their tail between their legs. And then people realized it was going to be a much longer war. In 1862, we have Antietam, which is in Maryland, and that was the bloodiest war. And Lincoln called it a victory for the Union because it was a they even though the Union lost more soldiers, the South, the Southern rebel armies left, and but they would be back into Northern territory at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, and this was the biggest battle. After this battle, the South was always on the defensive, never really instigating battles, and the generals, Grant really changed the tactic of always in hot pursuit of the rebel armies. So they never really allowed them, after this point, they never allowed them time to rest, and they just continued to go after them for another couple of years. Let's talk about technological innovations. You've got a lot of improvements in firearms. You also have the Gatling gun here. You have the ironclad ships, so that's the first armored ships to fight, and you had the Monitor and the Merrimack. So that was a big advancement. And then you have balloon, which was used for reconnaissance, and there were a lot of other innovations too, but those are the main military innovations. Here's the Gettysburg Address. So you had the Battle of Gettysburg in July, and then November of that year, 1863, you had the Gettysburg Address, where Lincoln says, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So with this and the Emancipation Proclamation, we have a new purpose for the war, and it's not just the the first purpose was to restore the Union, and then later it was to free the slaves. So that's what that new birth of freedom is talking about, and it kind of goes back to the Declaration of Independence, and Lincoln really saw that as really saw this new birth of freedom as giving giving what was promised in the Declaration of Independence, the actual the actual meaning, actual institution of what was promised in the Declaration of Independence. So let's talk about freeing slaves. There were a bunch of times that slaves were freed. And Lincoln wasn't always behind it. From the 3rd of August to the 22nd of October, so you have 3 months in 1861 where General Fremont, who was in charge of of Missouri, instituted his own Emancipation Proclamation. So it was only in Missouri, and it really made Lincoln mad that he did this. He was worried that we were going to lose the border states if people were doing this. So he rescinded that, or made Fremont rescind that, and then replaced him because he was really mad at Fremont. Remember, this is John C. Fremont, who was the same Fremont who ran for president as the first Republican in 1856, and he lost. In 1862, we have Washington, D.C. emancipation, and they still celebrate that as Emancipation Day to this day. Congress passed a law freeing all the slaves in Washington, D.C. In 1863, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, which at that time freed very few slaves, but it was issued by Lincoln, and Lincoln, this showed that Lincoln was going to, change the purpose of the war from only restoring the Union to restoring the Union and freeing the slaves. In 1865, that's where we get the Juneteenth, which just recently became a federal holiday last year. So we're going to have our first, our first anniversary of Juneteenth this summer. And Juneteenth is when the last slaves, this was in Texas, were finally told that they were free. And then what really freed all the slaves, because there were still slaves in the border states that had stayed with the Union. Lincoln promised that he wasn't going to take away their slaves, and so by the end of 1856, we have the 13th Amendment, which is passed, and that frees every single slave. Just want to finish up by going over a few things that are overlooked during this time, because you got a humongous bloody war going on. So things regarding education, there were, and when I'm talking about this era, I'm talking about the Civil War and Reconstruction. Reconstruction, that's its own topic right there, but you have a lot of things going on. And let's get into them. So education, you have laws encouraging and actually funding higher education, land distribution. So you have the Homestead Act. In 1862, you also have an attempt by the radical Republicans in Congress to redistribute land among slaves. This doesn't really pan out, but it almost did, and that's where we get the term 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres was the original proposal to have to take land from the secessionists and the rebels in the South and to give it to their former slaves. And the numbers that were proposed were 40 acres. In one speech, there was a mention of giving them a mule so that they would be able to have the means of production. And the means of production at this time are still predominantly agriculture. So land and the tools you need for agriculture. Yeah, but that never came to fruition, but we still have this idea that land needed to be distributed to the former slaves to make them real, complete, and equal citizens. And we talk about reparations today. So that's where that all comes from. We have the Transcontinental Railroad, which is remember the Gadsden Purchase was for the original. The original intent for the Gadsden Purchase was to build a transcontinental railroad from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean, and because of the war that was delayed. But Lincoln and the Radical Republicans got started on building one on a more northerly route, and it comes together in Utah, where they have the Golden Spike. Let's see, Western. Oh yeah, so at this time they lower the standards for state admittance into the Union and also territorial organization. So you have states like Nevada that don't meet the requirements, but Congress just lowers the requirements and allows them to join. And you have Idaho Territory organized at this time. So Esto Perpetua. And then we also have lots of Indian wars, and that's its own subject too. But a lot of times that gets overlooked, but they were going on at the same time that the Civil War was going on. Sometimes intentionally, intentionally by the federal government, and sometimes a little less intentionally because you have these commanders out west, and a lot of them are just militias. They want to make a name because their brother officers are doing things, doing great things for the country and restoring the Union in the East. And so out in the far West, they want to make a name for themselves. So a lot of unnecessary conflicts occur during this time. And that's all I got for this week. Thank you very much.